Hi, my name is Adam Fielding, and welcome to my latest live stream. If you've joined me before, then welcome back. If this is your first time, then yeah, this will be interesting. This week, I figured I'd take a bit more of a sort of freeform approach to what I'm going to be doing during this session. So I've got a few ideas of things that I want to cover. First and foremost, I want to have a look at the track I was actually working on last week, which I've titled The Second Cycle, as I figured that was kind of apt, given that this is sort of the second cycle of my streams. Nice and original, I know. So yeah, I'm going to cover a few things in the track and kind of what I tweaked afterwards. Spoiler alert, it's not a lot. And I kind of wanted to spend a bit of time today talking about sort of how to get ideas going when you're really struggling to sort of start things. Basically, over the past sort of couple of weeks or so, I've been putting messages out on various social networks and forums, kind of asking people if they had any particular topics that they wanted me to cover kind of during these streams outside of the music making sessions. And one topic that kept popping up was the idea of kind of working with ideas when inspiration isn't really striking, kind of the idea of getting over writer's block, which I think can be a tricky thing for a lot of people. And it's especially bad when you're working to a deadline or something like that. So it's good to have a few tricks that you can kind of rely on to kind of overcome that a bit. So I'm going to share some of the tricks I've got myself, and hopefully it'll help you out. And sometimes it's good to just be able to kind of power through that writer's block, and once you kind of get over that and the whole sort of blank canvas syndrome, you can really sort of break yourself out of the cycle sometimes. First things first, this is the complete track from last week's session, the second cycle. If you haven't checked it out yet, it's I've archived it on YouTube, and you can listen to it on SoundCloud and all that good stuff. And there's links to the actual Reason document if you want to open that up on your end and have a look at it. One of the first things I kind of wanted to touch upon, which I sort of glossed over last week, which ties in nicely to this idea of getting ideas going when you're kind of struggling, is how I use blocks. Now I know that I probably sound like a bit of a broken record to a lot of people, but I really like using blocks as kind of an alternate way of working if you're really struggling. Sometimes it's best to kind of try a non-linear arrangement as opposed to just trying to start a song from start to finish. So that's kind of a nice way of just diving straight into it, and you can kind of flesh out a quick idea like an 8-bar loop like I've got here, and then kind of work around that. And I'm going to kind of show how I did that and sort of what I was thinking when I actually did that. Because last week I'm fully aware that I created this block and then just plonked it down and kind of faded it in. I didn't really talk about the actual process that much. So for those who didn't actually check it out last week, this is the actual block which the rest of the track is kind of built around. And this is the first thing I did last week, was to construct this block. One thing that's actually changed this week is I've taken the polyplex drums out of the actual block itself. So for a more accurate representation of what that should sound like, I'm just going to grab this section here, copy it and paste it into the block so it sound more like what it did last week. Basically, I was having some pretty annoying CPU issues last week thanks to using Reactor, and it was just choking my DSP, which is kind of amusing. I opened up the track afterwards and it was playing back just fine. So I think it's having to encode video and stream it and all that stuff just piled on top. It wasn't having a good time. So here's the block again with the drums, and this is what it sounded like last week. So that's the block. I think the whole block only really comes in at 1 minute 20 seconds. So up until that point in the song, I'm actually playing with iterations or smaller versions of that block. So going back to the start of the track here, actually before that, I'm just going to knock that out. At the start of the track, I'm actually using only a quarter of the block, so it's the first 2 bars of that block. So if we look at the block here, it's just those 2 bars there, which I'm just going to play now. So, you know, I'm teasing in sort of the idea of a melody, but I'm sticking with one root bass note. It's not really progressing much at the moment. So that's kind of a common trick that I use, is to use a very small chunk of a block to kind of ease the listener in and kind of keep things reasonably static while I bring in individual elements. So in this instance, I'm bringing in things like ambient textures, which I'm fading in using the low pass filters on the SSL mixer. Another trick that I tend to use is if I'm using a synchronous device or any kind of sort of pumping effect, I'll have that fade in over time, just so the listener kind of, it sort of teases the idea of rhythm without actually providing a really solid rhythm to work with, which it's a problem I used to have, where I'd be working on a track which didn't really have any particularly strong rhythmic element at the start, and then it would come in and kind of startle the listener and kind of be like, oh, that sort of came out of nowhere. It doesn't really make any sense. So having sort of any kind of gated or sidechained or any sort of pumping element in the track, just to kind of give this vague semblance of rhythm, can kind of help the listener sort of on their feet when you bring in the percussive elements. So after those 2 blocks, I bring in this block section here, which is it's only using the first 4 bars of block 1. So if I go back into block 1, I'll play those first 4 bars. So now we're adding in an extra chord, an extra layer of progression. I say an extra chord. All of these are just single notes at the moment. The chords don't come until, well, pretty much the end of the track, really. It's an interesting one because most of the chords in this track are baked into the actual synths themselves. So if I just mute that. So again, I'm still not using the entire block, but because I'm still introducing elements, hopefully, this was my intention anyway, it shouldn't be sounding too repetitive to the listener at this point anyway. Bearing in mind that I only created 1 block in the first place, there is always the slight concern that the track is going to become too repetitive if I just rely on the same elements over and over again. So I kind of carry on along that vein with the microtonic percussion coming in here. So if I just solo that. So that's the sort of glitchy percussion that sort of underpins the main percussive hits. So that fades in, and again, like, we've got this polyplex stuff here, but that's kind of slowly fading in as well. So nothing comes in too suddenly, which kind of worked in my favor, really, because, like I said, I was working on essentially an A section for the entire track. So working with just one section, it's good to kind of have the elements fade in slowly and kind of work with textures rather than sort of any drastic chord changes or arrangement changes or anything like that. If I had more time, it would have been interesting to introduce a B section, which, interestingly, I sort of cheated with later in the track, and that's something I really wanted to mention. So it kind of continues along that vein until we get to this instance here, which is basically just the block as I wrote it at the start of the session, but with some extra effects thrown on top. So I'll just play that so you can hear what I mean. So it's basically just that block that I created. Like, there's not really a lot that's changed there. I think the only kind of differences were some slight percussive variants in the polyplex, because that was relying on the drum sequencer, and some probability triggers. And there's also this extra kind of shimmering granular effect, which I want to talk about in a second as well. But that kind of comes in. That's really the only thing that changes between that section here and the following section. The following section is kind of, it follows in the same kind of vein, but with certain elements taken out at the end of the block. This transitional effect at the end here, and the sort of shimmering granular effect underneath. So just playing that. So that's the first point really where things really change and I stop using that one block. And even after this section I start using that block in a slightly different manner, which I completely glossed over last week, but actually is quite an interesting way of varying things up. So it's just the same thing with some extra effects thrown over the top, the transition at the end, and then it drops, and then it's just kind of pretty much a straightforward single note section with some guitar ups over the top, just to add a little bit of variation. But the next section is kind of where things change up a little bit. So the interesting thing about using blocks in Reason is if you draw them in, like so, that will just play the block from start to finish. So that's exactly what you'd expect. I would just play. Well, actually, I'm not going to play it. So it would just be that block as it is from start to finish. Nothing particularly interesting there. But if you resize it, so if I kind of take these handles and just kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, and bring it over 1, 2, 3, 4. So now the block will have shifted 4 bars ahead. So what it'll actually be playing is the second half of the block will play first, followed by the first half of the block. So what that means is it kind of gives the illusion of a chord change, but actually it's just playing the original 4 chords that I had originally, just in a different order. That's kind of an interesting way of messing around with blocks, because it means even if you were to go back and mess around with the actual block itself, it would still kind of update all the other instances of the block, even though you've kind of shuffled it around completely and it's completely different. So that sounds like this. And even then, the chords are different because I've actually drawn in some extra sections here. So it's the same sustained. I think it's a yeah, it's an A. So it just plays that sustained A for the second half of that block, while relying on the final 2 notes in the block itself. So you get this slightly different sort of flavor. But actually, it's a bit of a cheat, because I've just taken the original chord arrangement and just kind of flipped it on its head. So it's, like I said, it's a bit of a cheat, but it works, and it's kind of a good way of getting around creating another block, or or something like that. So it kind of continues in that vein, and up until this point, where it goes back to just repeating the first 4 bars of that block for the final 4 sections here, where it just kind of fades out basically. I wanted it to sound reasonably kind of stable as it was winding down. I didn't want it to play the full 4 chords, just those 2 chords over and over again until the end of the track. So that's kind of an instance of where you can take one block and kind of vary it up in such a way as to give the illusion of kind of change and progression, whereas actually you're just kind of flipping things around and kind of making slight tweaks here and there. So even when I was kind of writing this and I flipped this section here back to front, before I actually changed these sections here, which I'll delete here just so you can kind of get an idea of what I'm talking about, it sounded, and without those extra hats, it's just... So yeah, without that kind of static note in the second half of that section there, it does sound a little wonky, which is kind of why I changed it in the first place. But as a starting point, that's a great thing to work from, and it's just a case of taking the block and flipping it around. I haven't written anything new at that point besides the pad chords, but that's a great starting point. So if I just bring those elements back. So another thing that I wanted to talk about, which I kind of glossed over. Oh, actually, someone's mentioned that works with Rex files too. It's a great way of kind of, and that's a really good example of kind of adding variation over the course of several bars. Is sometimes you can take a loop. Say you've got a 4-bar loop, you take the first 2 bars of that loop and have that repeat, I don't know, sort of 8 times or 6 times. And then have the whole loop play. No, my maths is completely wrong there. Basically, what I'm saying is you take the first 2 bars of the loop, have that play over a particular section. Then, when that section is coming to an end, say in the final 4 bars or so, you have the full 4 bars play. So you have 2 bars, 2 bars, 4 bars, just to kind of give that extra bit of variation. So I think that's kind of an important aspect of arrangement, is to kind of not have everything kind of come in immediately, unless you're kind of going for that particular feel. And for me, in particular, last week when I was doing this, I was still kind of finding my feet with the whole live streaming thing and that whole bit. So I decided blocks was the way to go. I'm going to start messing around with kind of shifting things around in the block and play it safe a little bit, and it worked, I think. So that's that. But another thing I wanted to show was this little device here, which I love. It's called the neutron particle emitter, and it's basically a little granular rack extension, which I think is it's quite overlooked. It's quite an old rack extension now. I must admit, I don't think it's much of a looker, but looks aren't everything, which is good in my case. Here we've got this guitar section here, which is just this little guitar arp. So that kind of fades in, but we also get this kind of granular effect kind of fading in underneath it, which is this neutron here. Now, if I remember correctly, that neutron is taking the audio from this Kong here, which is running. It's using the tape echo thing here, and then that's going into the neutron. I'm just gonna. Oh, not apparently. Right. I'm just gonna turn the feedback down, so shut up. Right. So it's taking its input from the Kong here, which is just the tape echo effect here. That's going into this neutron, which is then pitch shifting it up 7 semitones, so it's kind of a perfect 5th effect. But with the guitar ups, it just adds this really nice kind of counterpoint, which I really liked. But that's not the first thing that I used in the track itself. It's a really good effect, and I just kind of wanted to highlight it a little bit here. You can use it for interesting kind of drum shimmering and that kind of thing. To be honest, I myself had kind of neglected to use it quite a bit, so it was I was glad it kind of worked out when I brought it in last week. But you can do interesting things like holding the buffer and kind of adjusting the controls. They're all fully automatable, so yeah, I'd strongly recommend checking it out. It's really, really great, and it works great as an aux send to kind of bring in. And I think I'm going to struggle in the future not to over rely on it myself, because it's such a nice little effect. Something else that I wanted to talk about as well, which I sort of glossed over last week, is some of these pads. I'm not going to kind of go crazy into sound design this week because, I'm just not. But I'm going to talk a little bit about how these are actually structured. I've actually got another video on YouTube called Anatomy of a Sound, where I go into one of the patches that I created for the refill that this is taken from, which is called Europa Relay. But I'm going to cover some of the stuff here because I think it's interesting from a sound design perspective. So if I go here, I'm just going to play a single note, and I'm going to disable all the effects that I've got running on it. I think it's that one. Right, so I'm just going to disable that and that. So now the next note I play will just be the Europa synth on its own with no extra effects besides the ones in the synth. So I'd like to say that this isn't just an excuse for me to shill my own patches again. That'll come later. There'll be plenty of that. Yeah. So one of the things I kind of mentioned last week was the idea of splitting the individual oscillators in this Europa patch into kind of different frequency bands, so they're not all fighting for space. And that's kind of something that also translates into the master filter section here in the spectral filter as well. So if I just mute engines 2 and 3 and just play the first engine. So that's the first engine, this is the second engine. This is the third. And all together. So you've kind of got the first engine, which is sort of filling out more of the top end, not to a ridiculous degree, but it's definitely kind of got more presence in the high end than the other two engines. The second one is kind of more sort of mid-heavy. And the third one is it's just filling out the low end and the low mids, just to kind of give it a bit of presence. So if I mute the third engine, you can really tell the difference. It just sounds much more hollow, which is it's interesting when you consider how simple the third engine is. It's just this drone. So I thought that was kind of interesting. So in this instance, the engines 1 and 2 are actually going through this low-pass filter here, which is controlled by envelope 1. Now it's not rolling off the highs completely, but it's kind of just smoothing it out a little bit. So if I disable that filter and just play the first two, it sounds quite shrill without that kind of roll off. So just playing it again. It sounds much smoother. Like, I mean, if you really wanted to, you could just adjust that. But that's also mapped to the mod wheel, so you could just kind of, if you want that extra sizzle, you can bring it in. So that's how that works. So with engine 1, I'm also routing it through a high pass filter because the other two engines have plenty going on in the lows, or the low mids and the mids as well. Whereas the first engine is really kind of, it should be filling out the top end more than anything else. And if I turn that off, it would sound much more crowded. So if I do that, so that's without, and that this is with. It just gives the patch more space to breathe, and it's all this kind of stuff that I like to take into account when I'm making sort of atmospheric patches. How is it going to fit as a mix? You've got to think of it as 3 distinct layers forming their own sort of mini mix in a way, which is less of an issue if you're working with sort of single oscillators or monosynths or that kind of thing. But with Europa in particular, it can get a bit sort of mushy and very crowded if you don't think about that kind of stuff. So frequency separation is very important in that regard, and I feel like that was something I sort of glossed over last week. So, and even with the simple Poly 6 bass synth that I brought in, the cutoff is incredibly low on that because it's bass. If I were to crank the cutoff right up, it would sound like, it would sound silent because I've got it soloed. Brilliant. Okay, that's fun. Yep, that's probably right. Right. So it goes from kind of this smooth, rounded bass to just being, this sort of Souls at Dawn kind of lead, which is great in certain instances, but not when you want a sort of simple bass patch. So I kind of rolled off the highs completely there, and because there's nothing else really clashing with it too much, because everything else is kind of using this pumping sidechain kind of effect. Nothing's really clashing too much with the bass. So it's a case of kind of mixing the elements inside the rack as opposed to kind of on the mixer, which is kind of an interesting way of working. And that's how I tend to operate a lot of the time, is kind of thinking about how elements will fit together before they hit the mixer, because then at that point, when you're actually mixing the track, a lot of the work has kind of been taken care for you. So when you actually hit the mixer, you can kind of just make slight adjustments, use the high pass filters and low pass filters to kind of keep everything in check, which is, I understand that's kind of not a way that everyone works, but it's that's me for you. So that's that. I think that's pretty much everything that I wanted to kind of cover that I changed in the track. Like I said, I did make some slight mix tweaks because I'm using headphones during these streams. So I thought it'd be interesting to just kind of have a listen to it with fresh ears the following morning and just make a couple of tweaks. But I didn't really change a whole lot, besides kind of just balancing things out a little better. But it still feels very much the same as it did during the live stream. And I think that pretty much covers what I wanted to cover with this particular track. So I will close that for now and start talking about some other stuff. So this idea of starting tracks when you're having a bit of a block or you can't get ideas going, it's a real issue that I struggled with, particularly sort of when I was first starting out, and kind of when I didn't really have this kind of mindset of writing finished songs. I did get stuck in kind of 8-bar hell much more frequently, sort of say in the noughties than I do now. So the one thing I will say and start off with is to say that this is much less of an issue if you have a dependable palette of sounds that you can start with. So one thing that I've been spending a lot of time doing recently is sort of collating all of my patches into sort of one huge sound bank, basically. I got kind of sick of having all of my patches spread all over the place, all over my hard drive in various refills and folders and all that stuff. Someone said, sorry if you already covered this, but I frequently have trouble turning an 8-bar loop into something more. I touched on that with the block stuff, but I will touch on that again. So I sort of collated everything into this sort of huge patch library and kind of gave it very, very simple stuff. So I don't tend to use tags and that kind of thing to describe sounds particularly often. I sometimes feel like that can actually be a detriment if you have everything tagged meticulously, and you think to yourself, there's this one particular sound that I want to drop into a track. So you do a search using Massive as a good example of this. In fact, I'll just fire up Massive so you can see exactly what I mean. So say I'm using Massive and I open it up and I go to the browser, which has this excellent tagging system. So I'm going to go into my soundbank Massive Cyberscapes because I am a gigantic sellout and I want to shill my stuff, damn it. So I've got all these patches here, and I think to myself, actually I want a soundscape that's hypnotizing and synthetic and actually granular. That's kind of me screwed. I guess I'll be looking somewhere else. Whereas I could, if I were just kind of looking at the patches themselves, I could look at this, go to this patch library, and I've got all these ambient textures here. I could drag one in, and then say I wanted something that sounded kind of granular. Then I could process it into a way, in a way that kind of made it sound granular. So I'm not kind of excluding stuff just for the sake of fitting this idea that I've got in my head and wanting it immediately, which can be super useful. But if you haven't got something that kind of fulfills those specific criteria, or if you've only got one or two patches, you might be kind of doing yourself a disservice by overlooking patches that would actually suit the track pretty well. So what does this actually sound like? I'm just going to turn this channel down. So that's kind of cool. So yeah, so that would be kind of an interesting ambient texture that, maybe I was looking for something kind of, it's sort of a bit dark that I wanted in my track, whereas if I was sort of setting myself those parameters in massive and looking for specific things, I might have completely overlooked that. So for me personally, I prefer to just have things laid out to me in a big list and just let me have a look and see what's going on, which is kind of what I've done here, which is to collate all of my patches that I've released over the past several years and just put them into a big folder and kept the ones that I particularly like. So I've got them broken into things like chords, keys, leads, bass, pads, and sequences, and ambient textures. So for me personally, that's a great way of breaking up my patches. And I know if I want to create a pad that has more of a kind of a more of a key type feel, for one of a better word, I can always take a key patch and just adjust the envelope to suit me. So this is kind of perfect for me, because now I know I've got this huge library of sounds that I know I can depend on and will suit me fine. So that's I think that's kind of a big stumbling block for a lot of people, is just kind of having everything broken up all over the place. If you can find yourself a selection of sounds and kind of get a good sonic palette, that's a fantastic way to start. And I released an album earlier this year called Mesmerer, and that a lot of the sounds in that relied on Europa Relay. So it wasn't an intentional decision at first, but because I was sticking to that one particular sound bank for a lot of the sounds and kind of manipulating them from there, and I was using kind of another few sources of sounds as well, but it was pretty much consistent across the album. So it has this consistent sound, but it sounds varied enough to kind of to not sound repetitive. So I kind of feel like that's an interesting thing. Someone said, can you review music made by Reason users at some point? To be honest, I'm probably not going to do that, because I am a terrible critic. But one thing that I have been considering, which was a suggestion from someone else, is the idea of taking people's ideas and then fleshing them out as kind of an alternative to the music making session. So if you have any ideas or anything like that, I feel like I'm going to regret this, but if anyone has any ideas or any 8-bar loops that they think are great but they can't do anything with, they want me to have a look at them live during a session, send them over to me, and at some point I'll put out a proper call for this kind of stuff, because I think that could be really interesting. But I'm not going to be reviewing stuff because, yeah, I'm an awful critic. Yeah, where was I? And if you want feedback on your tracks in Reason, a great place to do that is the Reason Talk forums. If you go to the music section, check out some other people's music, and leave a few comments yourself, and then kind of get into sort of talking to other people there, then I'm sure you get some feedback on your tracks. So that's kind of a good place for me to start for kind of starting off with writing something. I would say it's having a good palette of sounds to work from. It doesn't have to be as ridiculously vast as this. It can just be something really simple. One of the things I really like doing is, if I don't want to work with Reason and I fancy having a break from staring at a screen, I've got a kind of quite a modest hardware setup kind of separate on my desk, which is completely separate to everything else. And that's sort of, I only ever have 3 or 4 elements plugged in at one time. So it's a very kind of, in terms of how it sounds, it's quite sonically limited. But sometimes that limitation can breed creativity, and because it's only a few elements, it's really easy to get a sound that I'm happy with out of it, because they're not as versatile. I'm not going to kind of get crazy unusable sounds out of it. Although having said that, I did just pick up a Volker FM, so I probably will be getting some horrible sounds out of it soon. But that's my problem. So the second kind of biggest hurdle I tend to find is blank canvas syndrome. So you've just sat down and you've got this idea in your head and you want to maybe get it down or something like that. So you've got your palette of sounds, you look at this and you're like, actually, okay, I don't think my mind's just gone completely blank and I can't write anything. I have no ideas. What am I going to do? So this is kind of an instance where I would suggest one of 2 things, one of which requires a little bit of pre-planning and the other one requires using a separate service. So the first suggestion I would say is, if you're not writing music, the best thing I would suggest would be to kind of sit down and work with the tools that you've got work with some of the synths in Reason, see what sounds pop out, save what you're creating. You never know what might work. Bounce it to audio, see what happens. Go, just mess around and create loops. Let's keep those separate. So one thing I did last week was I went into this handy folder that I've got here, which is called Patternarium. So this is based on a service run by Sonic Charge for their fantastic microtonic drum synth, which I would strongly recommend checking out. I'm actually trying to think when it originally came out, but it's still a great drum synth. And there's this interesting thing called Patternarium, which is kind of a semi-generative pattern generator online. You can check it out at your leisure. Unfortunately, it requires Flash, but you deal with it. And so what I did was before the session last week was I just kind of went over there, went to Patternarium, grabbed some of the patterns from there, brought them into Microtonic, took some of the elements out that I wasn't sure I'd use, and just bounced them. So I ended up with a bunch of loops like this. One of which ended up forming the kind of that glitchy sort of top layer in the track, where I kind of threw the glitch machine's fracture effect over the top of it. So that was kind of, at that point, I could have spent ages and ages sort of creating this interesting, this sort of manually kind of editing all these glitchy effects and kind of doing that throughout the entire track. But that would have been a complete creativity and workflow killer for me at the time. Like, that's the kind of thing that I would say, if you're not working on the track itself, it's good to kind of take a step back and then sort of work on something else and then bring it in, unless you're working to a deadline, in which case you kind of need to be prepared, I guess. So that's kind of an interesting way of looking at it. And also, another thing I would suggest is sort of the antithesis of this is, if you do have a complete track and you're not entirely happy with it, sometimes it's interesting to kind of go through a second pass of the track you've already written. So I didn't do that with the track that I wrote last week, but it would have been interesting to kind of go back and kind of go into a little more detail over what was there, maybe kind of put in some more manual edits and that kind of thing. So adding like an extra pass can kind of give an extra sense of variation, and kind of it gives it kind of more of a clinical feel if you want it, if you kind of want to go for that, or just adding some variation, or stuff like that. So that's one way of getting over the problem of having a blank canvas, is to just use some stuff that you've already prepared beforehand. And this is why I'm a big fan of, if you are working on ideas and you're not getting anywhere, don't get rid of those ideas. Bounce them out and keep them in a folder somewhere. So I'm just going to show you guys something quickly. I'll just minimize that. So I've got this folder full of unfinished ideas that I've written over the years. I've actually been kind of bad at keeping track of this. So this folder is full of unfinished ideas, some of which I've actually kind of dipped into. But because it's all been bounced to audio, I don't have to open up all the individual tracks in Reason and kind of dive in and have a look. I can just, go here in macOS and just have a quick listen. So I might think that's kind of a neat thing that I could use. Now I can find that track and kind of grab those elements and go for it. I'm not wasting time looking for stuff. So keeping it, someone said fan of Bioshock. Oh yeah, what gave that away? Someone else has also said Microtonic was released in 2003. Still an amazing drum synth. Wow, I did not know it was 2003. That is, that's pretty crazy. So yeah, it's 15 years old and it's still pretty good. And there's the Pocket Operator version of Microtonic as well, which is pretty cool. So I'm a big advocate of not kind of wasting ideas or potential inspiration. There's I can't remember who it was who said it. It might have been Bjornlin. It's a quote that I like to trot out quite regularly. Where he said unfinished ideas are wasted inspiration, and I kind of agree with that. He also suggested the idea of if you're working on a track, try your best to finish it, even if you kind of have to wrap things up a little sooner than you anticipated. I'm probably paraphrasing massively here, but even if you have to do that, it kind of gets you into the mental rhythm of writing complete tracks, even if they're kind of cut a little short. It's better to wrap things up slightly prematurely than have an unfinished song sitting around on your hard drive for a decade and then never finishing it because it's wasted inspiration. So that's kind of interesting. So the second idea I had was to besides kind of using loops that you've already created or diving into old stuff, is to use a sample service like Splice, or I know people are kind of going crazy for Outputs Arcade at the moment, which I really, really need to check out. So those are great if you need to get started. So I think I've got quite a few sort of those starting blocks. So I'm just going to have a look. So say I was really struggling to get an idea going and I just wanted something. So that's a loop I could start with. So I can just drop that in. That's from some Black Friday samples that Wave Alchemy gave away a year or two ago. So there we go. It's just a loop. I think people have this kind of preconceived notion that if you're using something created by someone else, then it somehow invalidates what you're creating, and I think that's nonsense. If it helps you to get your ideas going, then I say go for it. So I'm going to kind of do what I did previously and just kind of chop that in half and sort of put it back to front. So there we go. It's very, very simple manipulation. I'm going to transpose that down a couple of semitones because why not? Then I'm going to split it into 4 chunks and reverse those chunks. And what does that sound like? So there we go. We've kind of got a little idea going here. So I could kind of flesh that out, and then this would turn into a music making session, and that would be kind of interesting in and of itself. And that sounds quite different to how it did originally. What was that sample? This piano 140. Dark tone. So there we go. So it's just, I've taken something that's made by someone else, and now I can take it one step further. So going back to my previous idea of keeping your patches well organized, something I've been doing again is kind of keeping tools and effects and stuff in individual folders. Unfortunately, it's a process that's still ongoing, so it's a bit bare bones at the moment, and this archive folder is a mess. So if I just open up my effects folder, and I've got this handy patch here called Neutron Fifths. So that's kind of, actually no, I'm going to use buffer pattern. Yeah, I'll use that. So this is a patch that kind of replicates an effect that I use quite a lot, which is to use this buffer device to kind of trigger essentially stutter edits. So I'm going to copy and paste that, and there we go. So if I just play that with the effect as it is in place. Okay, I'm going to adjust the gate because that's kind of ridiculous. But I'm also going to adjust these as well. So basically, the way I've got this set up is I've got this matrix pattern sequencer controlling when the stutter engages on this buffer effect. But I've also got this interesting guy here, which is this Thor. So this Thor basically it's got its own sequencer built in. So when those notes are triggered, it triggers the global envelope here, which is set to decay over a quarter note. I might actually make that a bit longer. So as that's decaying, it sends this sort of decaying CV signal out of CV1 here. So if I flip it back to the front, the global envelope here, I've set that so it goes out of CV out 1. So it's going out of CV out 1, then that goes into the length sweep on the buffer device. So what this means is if it triggers at the same time as a stutter is triggered, you get this kind of interesting sort of ramping down effect. I'll just play this and see if you can hear it. It's probably better with percussive stuff, to be honest. But this is kind of this is what I mean about keeping things that you use quite frequently, even if they're quite simple. Keeping them as sort of separate patches that you can just drop in. Because if I'd had to do this manually, you know, it might have just killed my inspiration. See, this isn't really working for me, so I'm going to drop this neutron fifths thing in, which is basically a variation on what I had in my track from last week, because I thought that was a really cool idea. So there we go. I've taken a loop by someone else and kind of done my own thing with it. And, you know, you can build around that and kind of add your own stuff over the top of it. And, you know, at some point there might come a point in the track where you realize, actually, I've got enough of my own stuff going on now. I might as well just delete that original thing there and keep it as your own thing. In which case, you've essentially used a loop created by someone else, made your own thing out of it, and that's inspired you to kind of do something else. And then you realize, actually, I don't need that anymore. It's an interesting way of working, and I would not begrudge anyone using loops as a way to kind of get going or get inspiration going. It's a great way to work, especially with things like Arcade now, which offer a lot more flexibility, as I understand it, in terms of variation and getting ideas going, which kind of brings me handily onto the next thing I was going to suggest. And that is, someone asked me how I get going if I'm working on a particular project to a particular brief. So what generally happens is I'll get a request. It will either be for a lot of tracks or just one particular bespoke job. If it's a bespoke job, it'll be very, very particular specifications. If it's not, it might be a little more lenient. Either way, what generally tends to happen is I'll get some kind of specification, some kind of brief, and in that brief will be some references to use. So there'll be musical references. Excuse me. So the trick here is to just not. The idea isn't that you open up these tracks and be like, okay, I'm just going to rip that off and kind of that's it, job done, great, I'm a genius. The idea is to kind of use those references, think about the instrumentation that's being used, think about the kind of mood that they're trying to set, you know, that kind of thing. Don't think so much about kind of melodic ideas or things like that, but think about the mood. That can be a really interesting way of kind of getting the creative juices flowing. If you start sort of dissecting kind of what instruments are being used and how you could vary that and kind of put your own spin on it. So an interesting example of that is a production album that I was working on a couple of years ago, which was it was kind of more geared towards sort of sci-fi kind of cyberpunky kind of stuff. And the guy who kind of got me on board in the first place, who's awesome, he sent me like this really interesting brief, and he created a mood board basically. And I found that super inspiring and super useful. It also helped that I'm massively into cyberpunk and sci-fi stuff in general, so that was quite useful. But just kind of having everything laid out like that, just visual references, I found that super interesting. And that's kind of something that I've actually been doing myself since then, is kind of sitting down and kind of thinking, okay, this project, where do I want to take it? What do I want to do with it? What kind of visuals come to mind when I think about it? What am I trying to do with it? So thinking about it from a sort of not, you know, entirely from a musical perspective, but kind of having musical references that, you know, maybe touch upon moods and that kind of thing could be a really inspiring way of getting things going. Someone else has said, which is your go-to sampler? Well, it's interesting you say that. For a long time, it used to be Old Faithful NNXT, because of course it was. You can't really go wrong with it. I've been using the NNXT less and less recently since they added VST support, because of course now Contact is a thing, and of course I'm using Contact for everything. So this is kind of an interesting example. So one of the instruments that I absolutely adore in Contact is called Damage, which is it's a really, really kind of big, cinematic, bombastic kind of percussive sound bank. So it has loop menus. So I'm just going to fire this up. This used to be much more of a painful process before VST support was a thing in Reason. So if I just press a note on the keyboard, Actually, I'm going to turn the tempo up and so there we go. That's kind of a neat loop to start with. So again, like it's really funny if you own Damage. I think it comes with Complete Ultimate now, but if you own Damage and you go through all the loops, it's amazing how many of those pop up in film soundtracks and TV soundtracks and that kind of thing. They're all over the place, and it just kind of goes to show that, you know, if it sounds right, it is right. So until VST support was a thing in Reason, I used to have to go over to Studio One and fire up Studio One and then bring in a Contact instance and then kind of work on it over there, and then bounce it out and bring it into Reason. It was all a bit of a pain. So this actually kind of ties nicely into something else, which is, again, kind of the idea of preparation and getting your palette ready. So I found that quite a workflow killer. If I wanted a particular, like an impact hit or something in a track, which is something that I tend to use quite a lot in production tracks. So instead of having to go back and forth between Studio One all the time and having to fire up Contact every time I wanted one of these, I decided to set up a multi-track document in Studio One and just trigger every single impact hit and then bounce it out as a individual sample, and then use a script to kind of name everything correctly. So it meant I've got this great folder full of impact hits, and I don't have to open up Contact to get to them, which is great. You know, it's just nice to have the option of being able to do that. So Contact is my favorite sampler at the moment. I'm still kind of getting to grips with the underbelly of Contact, which I find very interesting. It's really good, and I'd love to release something using Contact at some point. But we will see. This idea of using references, I thought, you know, that's kind of a good place to start. Have I still got that loop going? Yeah. So earlier on, going back to what I was talking about earlier, I was using blocks a lot. So this idea of non-linear arrangement, I think, is an interesting one to get out of a bit of a creative funk. So you might say you're in 8-bar hell and you can't get out of it. Well, don't get out of it. Embrace the 8-bar hell. Let's cut all of that and go into block mode. So I'm in block 1. I'm just going to call this main and pop that there. So now we've got this block, and there's something kind of interesting about how my thought process changes. It might not be the same for everyone if I'm working in a block. It's like a self-contained little chunk. I don't have to worry about sort of the rest of the song at this point. I'm just working on getting these 4 bars right at this point. So, oh yeah, that's right, I sped it up. So instead of starting from the beginning of the track, sometimes it's best just to kind of dive right into the middle. So I've got this kind of atmospheric thing going on. Great. Going back to what I said previously about having a dependable palette of sounds that you can draw from, I'm just going to create a redrum device here and go into my Wave Alchemy folder here and dive into Drum Tools 2 and just pick up a kick, because I know this is a fantastic sound bank, and I know that whatever I drop in now is probably going to sound pretty good or similar to what I'm after. And that's annoying. Let's try that again. So I'll go to process drums, bass drums. Actually, let's try deep and minimal. Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of chilled. So if I just zoom in and just copy and paste that. And then you could just work around that. So now I kind of feel like the next natural progression would be to add some hats. I was trying not to turn this into a music making session, but this is just kind of for the sake of this exercise. It's so So if I just have a couple of hats like that, just copy and paste those. If I was actually working on this properly, I would add much more variation. So actually I'm going to cut those hats out and create a new lane for those hats and paste them in there. So there we go. So we've got, let's say for the sake of argument that's reasonably ready. Okay, so actually I'll just drag in a little glitchy element from this patternarium thing, just because I want to. So we'll just copy and paste that. And the great thing about this, and another thing that I really like about Reason, is if you export stuff from Reason, it includes the tempo data inside the actual audio file. So by me dragging and dropping this stuff, which was originally exported from Reason into this project, it's all tempo synced, it's all in time, which is great. I really like that. There's no kind of waiting around for it to analyze it. It's right. So let's dive into this and let's drop that buffer pattern thing on, and that should add a little bit of glitchiness. So just by relying on a few tricks, you've probably noticed now I haven't actually written a single note of melody or anything like that. I'm relying entirely on stuff that I've either pre-prepared or loops that I've had kicking around and kind of manipulated the audio there, which is, it's a different way of working, and sometimes that's what you need to kind of kick things into gear. So, what I might do next would be to kind of pick up a guitar or use one of the hardware synths I've got to kind of record something outside of Reason. You don't have to think, you don't have to kind of, sometimes it's good to kind of change the process and kind of see what pops out. Mick Gordon, who's the guy who did the music for the newest Doom game, which came out in 2016, he did a really interesting GDC talk where he really kind of rams home the message of changing the process and changing the outcome. And I think that can kind of be conducive to kind of inspiring different ideas and kind of getting the creative juices flowing again. That's why I have two separate setups. I have the software stuff and the hardware stuff. If I need a break or just to kind of recharge, it's good to kind of step away and just do something else that's still musical and might kind of give me some ideas, like in terms of theme or atmosphere. But it's completely separate to everything else I'm going. I think it's important to have that kind of an outlet. Something else I think can really help in terms of sort of getting your ideas going is to say, like, give yourself sort of not sort of really hard deadlines or strict specifications, but just kind of say, okay, I want to try doing something like this. Kind of come up with an idea that you want to kind of stick to in your head, no matter how ridiculous it sounds. It's like, today I want to work on some polka jazz, or I want to work on some acid funk and see what goes, what happens there. And it might end up sounding awful, or you might end up with something that pops out and kind of inspires other ideas. You kind of got to, I think sometimes you have to push your comfort zone, but it's good. I think it's important to have kind of all this prep work that I've done here with the FX, and kind of having sort of percussive loops and all these other loops and stuff handy, and sort of just techniques I can rely on. I think those are important to have when you can't come up with ideas, when you're sat there and you're like, I cannot physically come up with something that I'm happy with. Then you need kind of those cheats to kind of get you out. And I kind of feel like I'm doing it a disservice by referring to them as cheats. They're creative tools. I think they're just as valid as anything else. Someone said I like Disaster Piece in the Hyperlight Drifter soundtrack. Yeah, that's a really good soundtrack. I really like the Fez. Sorry, my mind went completely blank. I love the Fez soundtrack. That's really good. He did a really interesting talk on how he created some of the sounds for that as well. He used quite a lot of simple sounds in Massive and laid on effects for those. So that's kind of an example of focusing more on the melodic side of the spectrum and kind of processing the very straightforward sounds with effects to kind of give it a nice feel. So yeah, it's a fantastic soundtrack. I recommend checking it out. One other cheat that I really, really like, if you're working on a song and you're completely stuck about where to go. So let's say this is the tune I'm working on, and I haven't got a clue where to go. Obviously, typically there will be more than one melodic element in here. So yeah, this is actually not going to be a great example. Actually, let's see if I've got anything. Yeah, I might. Yeah. This is a little thing I was noodling with earlier on, but I haven't really done anything with it. So it's not particularly complicated, but I think it sounds quite nice. Don't know why it's in 4/4. That should be in 5/4. It's definitely in 5/4. So this is just, I was messing around with some ideas earlier on, and I thought, I'll take I was kind of compiling my patch library, and kind of I was kind of messing around with some keys, and I was like, I wonder what would happen if I took this key patch and stuck it through one of my guitar patches, and then put it through that neutron fifths combi, and this popped out. I thought it was quite a nice sound, so I kind of rolled with it. But again, it's like that idea would not have happened if I hadn't been keeping this library going on here, or if I hadn't just kind of thought, oh, actually, I kind of, if I go into my patches folder and I go into the guitar folder, I can drop something on there and see what pops out, or I could have dropped in one of these effects. By having the tools sort of within arm's reach and not having to go folder diving for everything, you save yourself so much time, and it's much more conducive to kind of getting yourself into the zone of just writing music and not focusing too much on the little details while you're getting the ideas down. So that's kind of an idea that sort of popped out. So where I was going with that is, say I was working on this and I'd listened to it for I've been listening to this for about half an hour and I can't think of where to go with it. A really, really, really simple way to give it a fresh feel is to just transpose it. So if I just drop it 3 semitones and just listen back. So it changes things kind of just enough to give it a slightly different feel, to kind of give you a bit of a refresher. So you kind of think, oh, actually, what if I tried this, or what if I tried something slightly different? Another sort of, on the topic of transposing stuff, another sort of cheat that I sometimes like to use, which is similar to what I did last week. Say I'm using a synth. This is kind of the, if I just open up my patch library folder, I have a huge section called chords. Now these aren't massively useful a lot of the time if you're working on a song and you've got somewhere with it, basically. But it's fun to kind of drop these in and just, because the chords are baked into the patch. So those are just single notes. So, it's a great way of kind of getting ideas started. So kind of following on from that, something that I notice a lot more in sort of old tracker music is, in tracker music you had a much stricter track limitation. So what people would tend to do is bake chords into the samples they were using in the track themselves. So you'd have a very particular chord for a sample, and instead of kind of playing different chords in the sequencer, they would just transpose this chord up and down. So it kind of gives it a very sort of hard chord change kind of feel. You're just transposing the notes up and down as opposed to actually, manually changing to a different chord, which is essentially what's happening here. So all the notes, they'll be transposed the same amount from the original root note every time. So you kind of get that kind of interesting feel, and it's sometimes good to kind of just work with that in terms of just melodic stuff. So if I just take this bar, so if I just take that and transpose that up like 5 semitones, it might sound awful actually. So So there we go. It's a nice, interesting sort of melodic change. Super lazy, but it kind of works, and it actually kind of reminds me of some of the stuff in the Mass Effect soundtrack for some reason. But I think there's a lot of that kind of hard transposing in there. I keep saying things like it's super lazy. It's lazy in the sense that it was quick to do, but if it works and it fuels your creativity and fits the context of the track, then I see no reason why you shouldn't do that. And it's another kind of tool in Reason's Arsenal as well is the players, which I find quite useful. So here I think I've just got it set so it adds a note under the note played, I think. Anyway, so I'm just going to turn the number of notes up, change it to F Lydian, and just play. Oh yeah, someone said about trackers. 4 trackers on the 4 channels on the Amiga. 2-pan hard left, 2-pan hard right. Yep, I remember that very well. Although I was a Atari STE man myself. The intro to Epic Pinball on PC is tracker based and has a single chord sample in it, and it sounds awesome. Yeah, I personally love that sound. It's in a lot of I think 808 State there's a few tracks by 808 State where they use a similar trick where it's just like a single chord sample pitch shifted up and down. And I think it sounds really cool. Yeah, I mean, if I wanted to, sticking with the idea of not using too much, relying too heavily on melodic stuff. This will sound awful, I imagine. Yeah, so that's... Yeah, this is a bad idea. If I just grab an ambient patch, Atmos thing, that sounds good. Sampled chords is the sound of early rave. Correct, it is. It really, really is. This might actually be a really good example of this. So I'm using Expanse here, which is a wonderful synth. I love the sounds you can get out of it, but it can be incredibly CPU intensive. I actually quite appreciate Blamsoft's kind of uncompromising approach to sound quality. Their synths always sound absolutely superb, but it does come at a price. So what I've done here is I've just bounced that to audio, that single chord. So I'm just going to delete that there, so I'll free up all that CPU time. And now I'm just going to chop the start off. So I'm just going to copy and paste that twice, and these two I'm just going to transpose those up 5. I've transposed that final one up 3. So I've essentially done what people would have done using trackers sort of 20 years ago, which is take a single chord sample and just transpose that. Although obviously these are much higher quality samples than would have been available then, because if they had this much memory to play around with, of course they wouldn't have bothered doing this in the first place. So again, it's instead of me kind of focusing on sequencing notes individually and that kind of thing, I'm working more with audio to get the desired results, and sometimes that can produce interesting results as well. So we've kind of gone into things like using references. Non-linear arrangement is kind of a way to get out of a bit of a funk. Transposing elements, transposing stuff that's baked into the track. Sometimes I find that committing individual tracks to audio can actually be quite inspirational as well, because once you bounce something to audio, it kind of makes you less inclined to mess around with it endlessly. It's like you're kind of saying, okay, that part's done, let's move on to the next one, which is something I really like about live instrumentation in particular as well. So that's kind of another thing. Like it's nice to have an instrument you can kind of just pick up and play for something, for kind of a bit of variation, just to try something different out. So that's kind of that one there. So yeah, so I kind of feel like we've touched on quite a lot of stuff here. I'm going to close that document, but I'm probably going to come back to that at a future date because I actually quite like that idea. So yay, that's good. Yeah. So there we go. That's annoying. I closed the other thing I was working on. Not that I imagine I would have done much with that. Yeah. So that's kind of, I feel like that's probably where I would go in terms of getting ideas going. I'd say think about working on non-linear stuff. Try different ideas out. Use references and loops. Don't be afraid to use references and loops. Like I said, I feel like there's this very kind of snobbish attitude towards using presets and loops and samples created by someone else, and I think it's ludicrous. At the end of the day, if what you're creating, if that's kind of helping you to create what you want to create, then I say go for it. It's, you know, I've never had a problem where I picked up a guitar and someone said, "Oh, well, did you make the guitar?" Well, no, I didn't. So it's more generally along the lines of put that guitar down, stop torturing it. So there's nothing wrong with using loops. And like I said, if you're using a loop to kind of get an idea going or to kind of get the creative juices flowing, there's nothing stopping you from removing that loop kind of further down the road anyway. And also keeping audio bounces of ideas. I think that's a super important one as well. And it's something that I've actually kind of got out of the habit of doing myself, unfortunately. Just having a look again in this patch library. So I've got this folder here called Tools, which I think is quite useful. So this is basically kind of a few quite simple stuff that I like, a few simple tools that I wouldn't really consider particularly complicated. But when you're kind of in the flow and you're working on a particular song, sometimes you just wanna drop in something like. I've got this thing here, which is the crossfade template. So if I drop that into a track, what this basically does is it's a simple combinator with a dry wet knob on there. So it's completely empty, doesn't do anything. If I were to put any audio through it, it would do absolutely nothing. Now what I could do is if I could put in an effect here, like the futz box, and I could take basically what this does. Move that to the side so you can see the cables correctly. What this does is it takes audio from the combinator, which has audio routed into it from the combi input. You could use it as an insert on a mix channel or a audio track as well. The audio goes to this spider splitter here and out into the left channels of these two mixers here. This channel 1 and these are panned hard left. Now only the left channel of these two mixers actually goes back out of the combinator. So instead of using the main level knobs on the mixers to control the dry wet level, I'm using the pan pots instead. Now you're probably thinking that's an incredibly stupid idea. Why don't you just use the mixer levels, you fool, and just do it properly? Well, it's interesting you say that, because there's a very audible difference between using the level controls and the pan controls on the micro mix. So you end up with a much more kind of seamless crossfade when you use the dry wet knob in this instance. In fact, I'm gonna grab a actually I'm not gonna use the futz box. I'm gonna make it much more obvious and use a Scream 4. So I'm gonna put the audio into the Scream 4 here and route it back to the left input on channel 2 on both of these mixers. And now I'm going to remove that. I feel like I'm making a bit of a mess of this. So I'm going to create a device, just make it a Dr. Rex, I think. There we go. And let's just have drum supply, or loop supply rather. Let's just drop. There we go. So it helps if you have a mix channel. So the audio is going out there. So that's completely dry. That's completely wet. So it basically allows you to put a dry wet knob on any instrument, even the ones, any effect, even the ones that don't have dry wet knobs, like the Scream 4 here. So that's kind of neat. It's a neat little trick. So it's not particularly complicated, but sometimes, you know, you're working on a track and, you know, actually programming this thing and the knobs correctly is just, it's a bit of a creativity killer. So you just want to drop that into a track. So you want to, say I was working on a track and I wanted to fade that Scream 4 in over time. Now I can just drop that crossfade template in, drop the Scream 4 in, and just automate the dry wet knob. So if I just automate that to fade in over 8 bars, sure. So it's just a case of kind of giving yourself extra functionality that, you know, it's one thing that I really like about sort of the native devices in Reason. There's actually a very surprising amount of stuff that you can do with them if you just kind of think of little workarounds and hang on to those workarounds. So another thing I like to do is I've got this this Thor effects crossfader. So if I drop that in here, it's a variation on the same thing. So this time the audio is going into this combinator but into this Thor device. Now the way this Thor is set up is I've got the mod matrix set up so the audio comes in, goes to filter 3 and comes out of the Thor. So at the moment that won't actually do anything. So if I just run this, that's not doing anything because the Thor isn't doing anything. So if I want to use one of the comb filters in the Thor, I just drop it into filter 3. Now you can hear that comb filter fading in. So you can use all of Thor's filters as an insert effect, and it has dry wet control. So that's kind of neat. It basically gives you access to all of Thor's filters, which you can control using the LFOs built into Thor, and you can use the delay and the chorus effects. So that's really cool. So when Thor first came out, I think Maelstrom has a comb filter built into it as well. So you could use the Maelstrom and the Thor as comb filters, but there are no dedicated comb filter devices in Reason. If you wanted to do that, you had to use Thor or Maelstrom, but the tools were there. Another interesting trick that I wanted to get around to, and actually kind of follows nicely into a topic that I wanted to cover in terms of getting your ideas going. I've covered kind of keeping all your patches and stuff in one place, and having a patch library and a palette of sounds to work from, which I would say that's, for me, that's kind of the main kind of part of getting an idea down, is having really good sounds that you can just dip into and start messing around with straight away. Sometimes it's good to kind of sit down and kind of look at the rack and kind of mess around with ideas and kind of synth patches and stuff and see what pops out, and sometimes that could be inspirational in itself. But I've kind of felt like over the years my processes of sitting down and creating patches and actually sitting down and writing music have become more distinct, which is, it makes sense, and especially if you're working on a track to a deadline, you don't want to be sitting down fiddling about with a synth patch trying to come up with something that you think is going to work correctly. You need to sit down and start coming up with ideas straight away, and I think having a really good palette of sounds to work from is the best way to do that. So we've talked about this palette of sounds and effects and stuff and useful tools, but what if say you had a really complicated setup that you wanted to rely on more often? So say you want to work on some orchestral stuff. You could kind of sit down and create a bunch of devices, create a bunch of contact devices, get everything routed correctly, get all the individual instruments kind of routed correctly, and then you sit down and that idea you had for writing that orchestral or that string part has completely vanished because you've just spent a bunch of time creating instruments. So this is where templates come in. So I actually have a Cinematic Studio Strings template, which I will fire up now actually. So this is kind of a neat way of just getting sort of more complex setups that you couldn't necessarily do with one combinator. Just kind of grab those, get them ready to go, and drop them into a track. Oh, that looks interesting. Right, so here we go. So I've got the basses, cellos, violas, first violins, second violins. Great. So that's all ready to go. Say I want some strings, I can just copy those, and bring them into a different document. Or if I was just starting a track and I knew that I wanted to have strings at some point, I can just open that template and get going, hit the ground running. So this is more or less rooted to how I would work, so I can just start chucking in some strings and just automate the mod wheels so we can just have a little bit of variation there. So there we go. So we got this sort of orchestral thing going here. So that's neat. So say I'm working on this track now, and I think to myself, oh, actually, you know what? I could really do with some acoustic drums. Now the thing about a good acoustic drum setup is it has to be vaguely tweakable, in my opinion. And you have to, it has to be tweakable and it has to sound good. There's like I tend to use Superior Drummer 2 quite a lot, which is a fantastic VST, but a lot of the time I'll open it up and I'll get a drum kit going and I'll listen to it and I'll be like, it's good, but it kind of needs something extra. It needs some extra sample triggers over the top. So what I've started doing is treating Superior Drummer 2 as kind of the source. It's basically a multi-track drum recording, and start using additional sample triggers to beef it up. So I've got a template that does just the template that I've got here. Yeah, so this is my acoustic kit. So if I just kind of program a very kind of quick pattern. Okay, there we go. Apparently I'm that's 3, 4. Yeah, so let's have some hats here as well. And here's the multi-lane edit mode, so I can see the other track underneath. Just very, very simple stuff, and I'll show you how this works in a second. Okay, actually, I don't want it that quick. So, right, the way this works is I have Superior Drummer here, which is what I was talking about earlier, which kind of works as the main kit. Sounds pretty good. Now, the thing is, I've actually got some samples running over the top of it. So if I turn those off, so you can hear the difference. Sounds much snappier with those samples. So that's interesting, but how's that working if I'm just using Superior Drummer? How is it triggering those samples? So what I've actually got here is I've basically set up Superior Drummer so the kicks, the snares come out on their own individual channels. So this is the kick channel, output 9 and 10 goes to this SD2 kick audio channel. Now if I open that up, there is an audio splitter here, so it goes in there, and that comes, because I still want the audio from that kick to play, it goes into this audio splitter. One of those outputs goes to the output on this audio track, and the other one goes to this thing here, which is the channel called kick sample. Now this is routed to a pulverizer where I'm using the follower to trigger a sample on a redrum. So if you watch this, if I just play that pattern again, you'll see the follower lights up where every time a kick's played. And every time that follower light comes on, it triggers that kick sample there. And it's the same thing with the snare. So the snare has a splitter built in there. It's got an RV7K in there as well because I was messing around with reverb. Let's turn that on. Interesting. So it's the same thing. It comes in here. One of the snare outputs comes out, goes into this reverb unit, comes out, and the other one goes into the snare sample here. So there's a pulverizer here, which follows the exact same thing, just different settings on the follower, and So every time that light comes on, it's triggering a snare sample. Now the great thing about this is if I were to, in the future, be working with multi-track drum recordings, I could just drop them in and treat them in the exact same way. And I've done that a couple of times before, where I've been working with multi-track drums and thought, okay, I want to use some samples over the top of the drums, just to kind of give it a bit of extra snap or extra kick. So this is kind of a neat way of getting around that without using external plugins. There are VSTs that do exactly this kind of thing, but the tools are there in Reason already, and it's not something that I would have really considered using as a sample trigger immediately, because it's not, the pulverizer is a distortion device. It's a distortion device and a filter. But because of the way it's put together, and because of Reason's semi-modular nature, you can use this distortion device as a way to trigger samples, and I think that's kind of neat. So there's that. So yeah, I think templates are incredibly useful, and obviously, if I'm working on a track and I want a decent sounding acoustic kit straight away, I don't want to be messing around with kind of creating all this stuff from scratch. I want to just kind of pick it up, copy it, drop it into whatever I'm working on. So that saves a bunch of time. I know there are some other DAWs that allow you to do something similar, but you can kind of drop it straight into the track. And I must admit, I do kind of wish Reason had that, but templates are kind of a nice little workaround for that. So I need to use templates more as well myself. And there's nothing stopping you. Say you want to work on a project with a very particular kind of set of sounds. You want to create your own palette of sounds. I keep banging on about this idea of a palette of sounds, but say you want something which just has like a simple but good sounding bass, keys, lead, pad. There's nothing stopping you from creating a template with those elements ready and present, just so you can sit down and focus on writing as soon as you get going. So there's that. So for some reason, templates are something that I tend to overlook, even though it can be, in terms of workflow, it's a godsend. And to be honest, I'd been struggling with getting a decent acoustic kit sound that I could rely on for quite a while. So when I kind of created this little setup here, I thought, wow, I should have this kind of readily accessible so I can, drop it into other tracks in the future and kind of go from there. So similarly, I've got a folder full of guitar effects now, which I didn't used to have. So now if I want, I'm going to be adding to this kind of constantly over time. There's this idea that I kind of read a few years ago. I can't remember who wrote the article, where someone said the best thing to kind of get in the habit of doing as soon as you can is creating your own kind of personal production library, or your own library of sounds. So that's kind of what I'm trying to do here by creating my crazy patch library and having sort of other stuff. I want to start bringing samples and stuff in as well, so I can kind of just drop those into tracks and kind of get going. And it's kind of a bit of a double-edged sword, because I've had my instrument library since sort of 2002 or something. It means I can still open up old tunes that I wrote, way back in 2000 and 2003, but I can't, it's just a complete mess. If I look at the instrument folder now, it's horrendous. So it's not particularly great. So this is kind of a way to reset that. So I'd suggest, if you haven't got in the habit of doing this already, do it. So there's that. I've got all the most useful stuff at the top of this list as well. So this is the stuff that I'll be relying on most in projects to come. And because I've actually kind of put everything in one place, I'm finding stuff that I haven't really used in quite a while now. So it's really sort of broadened my horizons in terms of the sounds that I'm using and that kind of thing. So there's that. Something else I wanted to touch on as well, which was a little trick. It'll probably be less relevant in the future, but I used a few wrappers in the Cinematic Studio Strings document. So I'm just going to dive in and show you why I did that. So if I close that. So here we've got for all of these individual string parts, there is an instrument called agent CM, and there's a contact window open here which I want to close, but there aren't any actual contact instances in this rack. So what I'm going to do is open up one of these agent CM thingies here, and we can see there's a contact instance on one of these panels. So if I click on that, it opens up the contact instance. Now you're probably thinking, that's kind of stupid. Why didn't you just create a contact instance? Well, unfortunately, there are a couple of problems I seem to be having with contact in Reason at the moment. One of which is that if I open up a patch, it sometimes takes minutes to actually load the patch. I'm not talking, minutes to kind of get sort of everything, all the samples loaded. I mean minutes to get anything going. Like if I create a contact instance and open that up, say I want to use Revolution, which is a great drum machine contact instrument by Wave Alchemy. It's basically loads of old, sort of old and characterful drum machines, really meticulously sampled. Say I want to drop that into a rack. I create a contact instance, double click on this instrument here, and I hope you like looking at this because it's going to be like this for the next minute or so. I'm not kidding, it's going to take a minute to load this. So here we go. I bet you were thinking there, oh, it's not going to take a minute, you're going to look kind of stupid now. But no, it's, I mean, I'm probably still going to look quite stupid, but it's, yeah, here we go. So I'm just going to sit here for the next minute. Whereas if I put contact into an individual wrapper, then it seems to work correctly. And also, for some reason, I've also noticed that embedding contact instruments and other VSTs inside wrappers at the moment seems to use less processing time than the individual instruments. It's very strange. And I'm really hoping that this is something that will be addressed in the performance update when that comes out. Someone said, have you batch resaved your contact libraries? I think I tried that last year, but I could be wrong. I might look into that actually. So yeah, so boy, I'm really looking forward to dropping these drums into this track. This isn't a gigantic workflow killer, so that's why. Oh damn! I closed the browser. But yeah, yeah, I really didn't think this one through. Oh, cool. There's a link in the chat window. I might copy and paste that when I archive this on YouTube, so people can actually see this suggestion. But that's great. I'll definitely try that, and I'll probably feel quite stupid if it works, but also incredibly grateful. So yes, thank you for that suggestion. Even if it doesn't work, that's awesome. I'll definitely check that out. So yeah, Revolution's open now, so that's great. Whereas if I were to use, unfortunately, it does classify itself as an effect, so you have to manually route it, which is why I've set this thing up. So if I go to Patches and I go to Tools, I can just drop Agent CM in here, and it's on its own mix channel, and it's not working. Oh, great. Oh, fantastic. Well, I need to work on that then. So I'm just going to create a mix channel and add a Nerve Systems Agent CM device here. So it goes into that mix channel. Let's get that routed properly. So if I open that up, now I'm going to do the exact same thing again. Just going to get a instance of contact and just drop that into one of these slots, and then sit around. Right, okay, so now if I open that up, and it's gone. Great. Right, and now if I open Revolution here, yes, thank you, Dispondo. I'll definitely check out those contact loading links, because this is something that has been kind of driving me a bit nuts. Oh great, it's going to take ages now. I think it's just because I've got lots of stuff open at this point, but that didn't take anywhere near as long as it did in the other instance, even with all this other stuff open. So I'm going to close that document because I think I've got way too much stuff going on. So I'm just going to create a new track there. Yeah, perhaps not the best time to be sort of loading up bunches of really RAM intensive contact instruments in the middle of a stream. Right. Yeah. So yeah. No, I love Contact, but at the moment, unfortunately, the way it's handled inside Reason kind of makes it a little tricky to use. But again, there are workarounds, and yeah, that's kind of why I've been using that. So yeah. So that's pretty much it, really. Yeah. So yeah, so that's pretty much all I was going to cover during this session, sort of in terms of kind of getting ideas going and kind of being organized can kind of help you out in terms of getting ideas going quickly and kind of coming up with decent ideas. So if there's anything that you'd like to ask me before I wrap this up, then by all means, please do. Just thinking, I have this sort of this feeling that I've forgotten to go over something, but no, I can't think what it would be. But yeah, it's definitely a habit that I would suggest getting into sooner rather than later. This idea of keeping yourself organized. It like I will be the first to admit that I am absolutely a really messy worker when it comes to working in Reason. Up until quite recently, I was just leaving tracks called things like, Maelstrom 1 and Thor 3 and Audio Track 5 and that kind of thing. And to a certain degree, yeah, I still do that. Someone's asked, do you plan on covering grain a bit in the future? Yeah, probably not today, but that is something I do want to cover in the future. To be honest, I actually haven't used grain anywhere near as much as I feel I should have. I used it quite a bit when it first came out, and I use it kind of occasionally to mangle textures. But to be honest, kind of Europa has been my life really since Reason 10 came out. So I feel like I need to really sit down and become more fully acquainted with grain and what it has to offer. I've created a few patches with it so far, but yeah, it's mostly kind of sporadic stuff. I need to go back into my old tunes and grab those and have a look. But it's a great tool. Don't get me wrong. I'm not sort of disparaging grain at all, and I think it's awesome. But I just need to use it a bit more. So yeah, right. So yeah, in that case, I will probably wrap things up there. And yes, so back to writing music next week. So yeah, I'll probably be using some of the techniques and ideas and stuff that I've been showing off here next week, and we'll see what pops out then. And yeah, hopefully it'll be interesting if I manage to get something that's workable next week to maybe go a little more in depth on some of the thought processes behind it afterwards. But yeah, we'll see. All right, brilliant. Well, thanks so much for joining me, and I should have this archived sometime soon. I just need to check a couple of bits out. But yeah, no, thanks a lot for joining me, and hope to see you next week. Cheers.